To another fortnight's episode of Media MD.
Glad to be here.
Okay. You threw me off already. It's already started and you've already thrown me off. I'm Reuben Morehouse.
Elliot Diebold.
And each fortnight on Media MD, we prescribe each other a piece of media that the other person has somehow missed.
Yes.
All right.
So what do you got for me?
This fortnight, I have something that I found very hard to describe, and I had to describe it a lot of times before I was comfortable with the words to categorize it as. It's Worm, and it's a web serial.
Wait, so the name is Worm?
The name of the thing is Worm, yes.
Okay.
And it's a web serial, so it's like
visual or
no,
like...
it's written, it's fiction.
Okay.
It's the best way I heard it described. Someone said to me, "Oh, so it's like fan fiction, but not for anything." And yeah, that's basically what it is. It's like fan fiction, but not about anything, not a pre-existing property. It's original fan fiction, if you will.
So yeah, fiction.
Yeah, I guess just. I mean, it's serialized as well. So the author published two bits every week.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is actually something that was ongoing for about 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And from I think 2011 to 2013, ended a while ago. And as you can imagine, 2.5 years of twice weekly updates means there's a lot of this one.
Yeah. Yeah, that does sound like a lot. I mean, are they like 5-word updates?
No, they're not. They're like, you could, each update is about a chapter in a regular book, I'd say.
Okay.
So yeah, all in all, I remember how we did the how long would it take to read thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did something similar for this. And I think it clocked out at about 90 hours of reading.
Okay.
So it's long.
Okay.
It's a long one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually started reading this probably about a month ago, but before I brought it to you on the podcast, I wanted to really make sure that I'd actually finished it. So I did, and it took me a long time. I was binging it pretty heavily at the start, like reading, like 5 or 6 updates, parts, a day, maybe more. And after about a week of solid binging of like 3 hours of reading a day, I think I was about a third of the way through, so...
Oh, God.
Yeah. So I'm not expecting you to finish this entire one in the whole fortnight, but...
Is there like an audiobook?
No, actually, that's interesting because it finished in 2013, and I was looking to see if he was planning on publishing a book version or an audiobook version.
Yeah, well, because a lot of these things end up getting published like standalone.
Yeah,
like,
and this was a big... this was like an underground cult kind of hit thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, because also books like The Martian...
Yeah.
became a thing, right? Like it was originally just some dude. It was like an engineer who just wrote it on the internet, and then it got like published.
It's the 50 Shades of Grey story, right? That's where you want your fan fiction to go.
Yeah,
yeah, a classic, exactly, a modern classic. No, I mean 50 Shades of Grey was fan fiction that turned into original property, and then
I actually
has become a whole
didn't
thing.
know that.
You didn't know that? It was originally Twilight S&M fan fiction.
Oh, really? I was okay with not knowing that.
Anyway, we're getting a bit off topic here, but So he has plans to publish it, but he has recognized that this was the first thing the author, whose name is J.C. McCrae, and I don't know what the J.C. stands for. It's never said anywhere. I looked for a long time. It took me a long time to figure out whether he was even male or female. I went to his author bio, and it was like, the author has done this. J.C. McCrae has done this, even though he was writing it. I found one time where he slipped up and he used he as a pronoun, so I'm like, yeah, gotcha. Anyway, yeah, I beat him. He's recognized that he has to go back and edit it a lot before it's ready for that. And he said when it finished in 2013, oh yeah, I have plans for it to become a published book at some point.
But it's on the internet.
It's been 3 years, so
So I get it's just because he was just sort of making it up as he went along, and he wanted to go back and retcon some stuff,
well,
or just
not
change
retcon,
the style.
just because he was writing. He was he is still such a prolific writer. He was writing so much that the quality can vary, and he wanted to make sure that there are parts of the story where he fixes stuff up, and there are parts where where he fixes things that he did wrong. Just because he was writing so much every week that, of course, there would be times where he was taking it easy one week or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
So he's actually started, since Worm ended, he's written some other web serials. One that's finished called Pact, I think, which I haven't started reading, but I probably will.
Okay.
And one called Twig, which is ongoing. He likes his single word names, apparently.
Very snappy.
And he's actually, fun fact, he's actually coming back and he's planning to do a Worm 2, just because this was his first thing that he ever wrote, and it was such a hit that that he wants to revisit it, I guess. Anyway, enough talking about the kind of backstory of the author and the thing. Let's talk about what Worm actually is. So, how would I describe it? it's a realistic superhero story, I would say, is the best way to describe it.
Okay.
So, have you heard of One Punch Man?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen little gifs on the internet, but
but you've not.
No, I'm not too familiar with it. I know, the general outline of the show is essentially, One Punch Man is a superhero, and he's like so good that nothing's a challenge.
Yep.
And he just has like an existential crisis about that.
Yeah, he's called One Punch Man because he can beat anything with a single punch.
Yeah.
Anyway, the comparison I would draw to One Punch Man is that One Punch Man has this whole kind of system where the question is basically, what if superheroes were real? What would happen, right? And there's this stuff with like, there's an association that manages the heroes, and there's all these kind of things. And in One Punch Man, it's played off as comedy, but in Worm, Worm is a drama overall.
Okay.
It's a pretty gritty and brutal drama at times. There's a lot of messed up shit that happens, a lot of twisted shit, but it's engaging. It's very engaging. And I'd say I'm going to refer to him as Wildbow just because that's the screen name he uses for all this stuff. One of Wildbow's best features as an author is that he's able to create all these really compelling characters and develop them, even though, I mean, they'll get their own little parts of this huge story, but they're not main characters, right?
Yeah.
And he'll come up with interesting powers and interesting ways for people to use these powers and all this really cool stuff that it makes it really engaging to read. Even though sometimes things like his descriptions and things like his battles are hard to follow at times, he really stands alone on the strength of his characters, I would say.
Okay, so like his writing style could use a bit of work.
Yeah, and this was the first thing he ever wrote as well. Sure. So it's kind of like, there are a lot of times when I was reading where I would think to myself, wait, what just happened? And I'd have to reread to like realize what exactly had just happened in the story. But the strength of the characters is really what drives it. So let me talk a bit about the characters. I'll give you a bit of an intro. So the main character of the story is called Taylor, and she's like a 14 or 15-year-old at the start of the story, still in high school, and she discovers she has the ability to control bugs.
Okay.
And that is kind of the seed of the story. She wants to set out to become a superhero, but she accidentally kind of becomes a supervillain. That's the only sting I'm going to give you about the plot, because this is a very plot-driven and character-driven story. Yeah. So I don't want to spoil too much for you. There's a lot of twists and turns in the story for sure. And it goes to a lot of really weird places, but engaging places, I would say.
I mean, so that's like a weird superpower. So
controlling bugs.
Controlling bugs. Like, it's like are they all sort of weird like that? Like, does he have just the classic, like, super strength, mind reading people as well?
Yeah, there are, like, mind readers, there are psychics, but it's very balanced, I would say. Okay, like, the powers all strive to be balanced.
So there's not like some tiers of characters that are just really over.
Well, there are, but there's in universe there's this thing called the Manton effect, which is how they basically say, well, this power's pretty OP, but I'm going to nerf it a bit. Yeah. That's what Wildbow was thinking, I'm assuming. So there's a character who can freeze time for people. His name is Clock Blocker, which is a great name. If he touches anyone, he can freeze them, but they become immune to anything while they're frozen, and it lasts a pretty random amount of time, between like 1 to 15 minutes, right? Okay. So it's, a strong power, but it obviously has its downsides, and that's the same thing with anything. So
did you ever watch the show Alphas?
I think I watched it once or twice, but I didn't watch it that much.
Because it had a very similar system where every power had like a downside.
And that's exactly the same as with Worm. In fact, one of the strengths of the story is that he presents all these characters and their weaknesses, and then the main character Taylor is she's not super smart, but she is able to think around these weaknesses and use them in a really interesting way, which is kind of where a lot of the good parts of the story come in. She'll think through these scenarios and be like, oh, I can use this power to do this, and it's cool, it's cool. It's a cool story. Yeah, and so she joins a group of other people who all have quite unique and interesting powers. I won't get into that too much, though. I think it's better if you kind of discover it for yourself. I'll tell you one, though, who is, I think, probably my favorite character in the entire thing. One of her best friends through the story is a person called, well, their superhero name is Tattletale, right? Okay. And her ability is, she's basically a Sherlock Holmes. She can intuit from really small pieces of information and kind of fill in gaps really well.
Okay.
She's a fun character. She kind of is a lot of the reveals because she'll just find these tiny little clues and link them together in really interesting ways. I'm kind of gushing about this a bit just because when I finished it, I really kind of felt bad for finishing it. It was something that I felt, I'd spent a month reading these characters and now it had come to an end, and it was quite sad for many reasons. I mean, this is a pretty realistic and gritty story, so there are, character deaths and shit, but
well, I guess, 2011 to 2013, that was like when Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad were at their peak, so that was it was the time for
that kind of stuff to happen. Yeah, for sure. So I've talked a lot about the positives of Worm. I think I should touch on some of the drawbacks. Let me talk about the structure. So it's divided into 30 arcs, right?
Okay.
And each arc has like 6 or 7 chapters or updates, right?
Yeah.
Parts. So there is quite a lot of it. And I'd say for about arc 20 to 24, it kind of slows down a little bit. There's a bit of a weird lull in the story. It picks back up a lot towards the kind of gripping conclusion, but there is a lull. I probably don't expect you to get up to that lull.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll make it that far.
Yeah.
But the way you're describing it, it sounds a bit like an anime or a manga.
Yeah. I'd say it's quite like that. Except the problem I have with a lot of anime is characters will make stupid decisions for plot, whereas that doesn't happen in this. All the decisions the characters make are decisions that character would make, and decisions that I would make if I was in that character's position, right?
Yeah, that's good. But I meant sort of in terms of like that structure where there's lots of arcs and stuff. It's very anime.
Although one thing about the structure, which I think is a big strength of Worm, is that in between each of these arcs, there's a little one segment interlude, which just takes a backstory character or a side character and tells an entire little chunk of story from their perspective. And I think...
Like, so story that you've already seen from the main characters, but just like a separate...
Sometimes story that you've already seen, sometimes...
Okay.
Sometimes, or usually I'd say, to hint towards something else that's happening in the future. But I think that's one of the strengths of Worm, because it really takes you outside and gives you this kind of whole world building aspect, and character building aspect as well, which really is a strength, I'd say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'll give you this one. I'll give you a word of warning. There are times where Wildbow's character descriptions and like event descriptions are a little bit off. So one thing I actually found which was really helpful for me was, since it's serialized and it's like a WordPress blog or something originally. Yeah. After each post, there's comments, and they're like perfectly spoiler warned because it was happening. It was happening in real time, right? Yeah. So the comments for that post will only be about that post and not anything that happens after. So reading the comments is also kind of a good thing to do to kind of make sure you got a grasp on what's happening.
Because hopefully if there's something that's confusing, other people
are confused about and are discussing it, and that kind of leads into this whole communal thing, which is a bit of a weird feeling because these are things people wrote like 3 years ago, but it still feels communal, right?
Yeah. Well, and I guess if there were like mysteries in the plot as it was coming out, and if there was a community around as it was coming out, there would have been discussions. And like
which
theories,
there are.
Which you get now on for TV shows online.
Yeah, but because it's serialized and these comments are like a timestamp of the time, there's no chance of spoilers, which is great. Yeah,
and you can sort of retroactively jump in and that's cool.
It's really good. And the other thing I'll say is one of the things that really helped me towards the end was just looking at the wiki pages for characters. Like, it's kind of like I can't remember what the other thing we were talking about was that had this, but it was a character will come back into a story. Oh, it was Salem's Lot, wasn't it? A character will come back into a story and the main character, Taylor, will be like, oh, she has this power, or he has this power, I can use it. And you're like, wait, who's that person again? I mean, there are a lot of twists, but the one main wiki for this has like the character descriptions first and then the plot second. So if you just look at the top of the page, you should be fine.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll like it. I think you will. See how far you can get through it. I mean, I think the start is some of the strongest stuff. But yeah, we'll see how you go.
Yeah, I don't really... There's not much superhero stuff to watch these days, so it should be fun to read it.
I mean, now is a bit of a drought for superhero media, right? But I think this is one of the best ones that I know of. At least one of the best like written fiction superhero stories that I know.
Okay, yeah.
Reuben here. Before we jump 2 weeks into the future on this one, I just thought I would point out that this next part of Media MD contains spoilers for up to Arc 12 of Worm. So if you're reading Worm and you haven't got up to Arc 12 yet, you should hold off a bit, pause your podcasting device, we'll be here when you get back. Yeah, make sure you've read up to Arc 12 of Worm before you continue this episode. All right, pause it now. And now that you're back, let's continue with part 2 of Media MD episode 13, Worm. And we are back 2 weeks later.
Whew.
Yeah, so this was a pretty intense one, huh?
Yeah, I've got so much to say.
Well, before you jump into it, let's just start with how far did you get out of 30 arcs?
This actually ended up being a really good fortnight for me to be doing it, because I had a lot of spare time, and I ended up getting through 12 of the 30 arcs.
Damn, that's pretty good for 2 weeks.
Yeah, it was just, like I said, it was just a fortunate. I was moving house, so there was lots of packing and unpacking, and I had to do a 6-hour drive multiple times. And I did manage to find there's an audiobook of Worm.
Oh, so you were listening to it while you're driving?
Yeah, and while I was packing and unpacking the house as well.
All right.
So that was a lot of time.
Luckily, it lined up quite nicely.
Yeah, and lucky there was an audiobook. So yeah, and I guess going to the audiobook. So I mean, I tried to read a couple of chapters just to make sure I was getting sort of the whole experience.
Yep.
And I ended up quickly leaving that. I'm not a huge fan of reading on screens. I don't know, it's some problem I've always had.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the kind of tactile sensation of a book and just reading words printed onto a page just feels so much nicer when there's not a glowing screen staring back at you.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it's just, I can read small bits on screens, but yeah, I think I read through about one chapter on the site and got to experience sort of how the comments and all that worked. But I mean, the audiobook itself is sort of a testament to how there is a community behind this thing. So it was a community project. It was basically a group of people got together and just recorded the audiobook for this. And so it was basically done as a podcast. They released three parts a week.
Oh, wow.
It was like Monday, Wednesday, Fridays.
They beat even how much Wildbow himself was releasing.
Yeah, and I think that's because there were multiple of them. And it still took about a year and a half. So the last episode came out in like June 2016. But the first episode was, uploaded back in sometime in 2014. So it was a little over a year and a half that it took them to push everything out, even at that rate.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of just speaks to how dense Worm is at times.
Yeah. And I mean, so we sort of talked about this on Facebook, but I brought the numbers with me. So it's about 1.7 million words, Worm.
Jesus Christ.
And so, yeah, to put that into perspective, the entire Harry Potter series is about 1 million. So we're looking at about 1.7 Harry Potter series. So it's...
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty hefty. And I've made it about a third of the way through, a little over.
And those books were written over, 6 or 7 years?
Yeah, this dude, J.C. McCrae must just write.
He can write. Yeah.
And because I think that was a big thing. I think coming into this, I sort of wanted to bring this up early on. Even sort of despite your recommendation, I definitely came into this not expecting much. There was sort of a sort of prejudice there against just something like a web serial, and I think that was
something that was written on a WordPress blog twice a week.
Exactly.
Yeah, I felt that too when I started it.
Yeah, I was sort of even if it's good, I mean, it can't be that good. So I really wanted to start by saying that maybe the expectations had something to do with it, but that was completely wrong. I've loved this, and I mean, the writing's not always perfect, but I'd say it's comparable to professional writing. Really.
Which is all the more impressive by the fact that we mentioned multiple times in the first part of the episode, which is this is the first thing he ever wrote.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the stuff he's writing now and see whether it's improved. But I mean, even if it hadn't, frankly, the writing was already good enough to, get you invested and get
for sure.
You reading multiple Harry Potter's worth of books in 2 weeks.
Okay, so enough about word counts and how great his writing is. Let's get stuck into some meat. What did you tell me more about what you thought about it?
Yeah, so I'll do a quick sort of plot outline, and I want to make sure I do this just because I plan on finishing it. So I don't want
you don't want me to spoil.
I don't want accidental spoilers to creep in.
Spoiler, Snape. He dies.
That was in Arc 10. No, so yeah, I mean, you sort of covered it. Really, yeah, so this girl Taylor, she can control bugs, and it turns out there are a lot more things you can do with bugs than I ever would have imagined.
She does use her power in quite inventive ways, doesn't she?
And it's not just her. I mean, everyone. I think really the biggest thing about this book was Serial that I just noticed as I was reading is just how well thought out everything was, like the whole world and everything. Like that was what really impressed me the most, was just he was constantly bringing things in and then fleshing them out later, and everything just balanced really well. Like you talked about the Manton effect and how that sort of just made everything make sense. And so even Tattletale, like you mentioned her in part one, the sort of, so I mean, you described it as a Sherlock Holmes, but it's even a bit more than that, because it's stuff she couldn't possibly know. Like it's basically her superpower is she can just sort of learn facts that she wouldn't otherwise know, but it's like it's easier for her if she does know. So for instance, she can like guess someone's password or the PIN number that they use, but it's easier for her to do that the more she sort of knows the person. And we're not just talking about like birth dates. Like even if they've completely made up the number, like her power is that she can just sort of know things.
Yeah.
And so at first, she kind of felt like a cop-out from a writing perspective, because it was just sort of like, oh, we can win now because Tattletale suddenly knows X, and that changed everything.
Yeah.
But the more, very quickly, by about Arc 7, I'd say, her power was very defined, and it really started to like influence what she couldn't learn, and I guess as I sort of came to understand how more, it became less of a crutch for the writing. It was almost clever the way he was integrating it.
Yeah, and the characters kind of intrinsically learn her weaknesses as well, and so they'll say like, oh, Tattletale's not going to be able to learn this thing, so let's go about this plan in this way.
Yeah.
And it's very, all the characters kind of know stuff and act like they know stuff, and it's very weird. It's refreshing.
Yeah, like, and that was a big part, is I liked how sort of there was depth to all the characters, and yeah, like even minor characters, just sort of as they were coming in, you'd very quickly get an understanding for how they think, and everyone was performing actions that sort of made sense. Like I never really feel like there was a character who came in and was just an idiot all the time, except maybe for Bitch. But
Yes.
then later on you eventually sort of find out that like one of the side effects of her power is like sort of it hurts her ability to socialize. So it was more, it was sort of like, oh, okay, well, she's just kind of an idiot sometimes, but it's not really her fault. It's a side effect of her power. There's also there was an interesting aspect where, and it sort of makes sense, like this is what you do in real life. A lot of the capes intentionally mislead other people as to the exact nature of their power. So like Tattletale pretends that she's completely psychic so then people think that she knows more than she does. So she sort of bluffs her way. Despite already being very knowledgeable, she bluffs that she knows even more. Skidder also had a few moments where she would sort of crouch down, or she'd cover herself in bugs and then crouch down and make the bugs spread out to make people think that she was made out of bugs.
Yeah.
And I liked that. Like, so little things like that. And even some of their enemies, like they get halfway through a fight before Tattletale would be like, oh wait, that's not their power at all. Their power is actually blah, blah, blah.
This, yeah. They can actually do this fucking thing, so you better watch out, guys.
Yeah, like they met one guy who said he was a teleporter and he could teleport anything, but eventually Tattletale figured out that he couldn't teleport everything. He could switch the places of two things, and they had to be of similar mass and volume. So the more similar the mass and the volume, the easier it is for him to switch them.
Yeah.
So he's often like, when he's on the field, he's constantly switching the places of fighters,
switching
and stuff.
people's positions, which kind of makes the hard to follow battles even harder to follow.
Yeah, and that's my biggest issue. Is I'm often, especially with the audiobook, I'm often halfway through a battle and I'm just like, man, I don't understand half the shit that's happening. Like, I'll understand little bits and pieces. Like, I'll understand the individual bits between two people, but then suddenly Taylor, like as she's narrating, will sort of drop back and expect, like, sort of say something about the battlefield as a whole. And I'm just like, man, how am I meant to know where everyone is in relation to each other?
Yeah.
Like, I understand.
You really need it. You need maps to follow the battles at some points, don't you?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I was thinking when I started this, I was actually like, this would make a really good TV show. But about when I hit about arc 8, I completely did a 180 on that and decided that this was much better as a book or like as a written serial. Because what really separates this, I think, from like, because superheroes in a visual media are obviously very done.
Yeah.
The intricacies of the powers and Taylor's thought processes in the fights, I just don't think they could be covered as well in a visual medium.
Yeah, and without getting into spoilers too much, there's a lot of stuff that keeps happening that is basically just about Taylor's thought process.
Yeah.
And things that would be very, very difficult to portray accurately without doing some kind of weird, like, Scrubs-esque pause the show so that the main character can narrate.
Exactly. Like, it would be super cringy to do it. And I think if you took...
Well, no, maybe it could work like Scrubs. Now that I think about it, I'd kind of like to see that.
But yeah, I feel like if you took away these intricacies and these thought processes, then there wouldn't be as much separating Worm from just any comic book.
Yeah, from
show.
Captain America or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so, I mean, I really like Coil as a villain. I don't know if he's the villain for the whole story, but he is at the moment.
I won't touch on that. We don't want to spoil things.
No, but he... I like his philosophy. I've always liked bad guys, so his thing's basically like he's recruited people, including like the Undersiders, so Taylor and gang. And the way he recruits people, like he's not one of these guys who's like intimidating with fear and stuff. He basically buys people out. So he gives you so much money and gives you the things you want, so that betraying him would essentially end up being like betraying your own self-interest.
Betraying yourself, yeah. His power allows him to basically accrue as much money as he wants.
Exactly.
Just as a kind of side effect.
Yeah, so he's very wealthy, and I quite like that, because I thought, and that was, it comes back to the thing, I think all of the characters, right down to just the minor characters in this book, are really well fleshed out and just really good. And anyway, Coil is a great villain, because I much prefer these villains who are operate like frankly, I think if I ever got superpowers and was trying to be a supervillain, that's probably the way I'd want to operate, is not manipulating people by fear, but you want people who you can actually trust.
You want them to work for you.
Yeah, you want them to want to be there. I really like the interludes where they go to other people's perspectives.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the story as well.
There's just enough of them that they really give you insight, and so it's great seeing like there was a Tattletale chapter. And there was one about Dinah, the girl who can see all the pathways, and you get really cool insights into how their powers work from their perspective. And I thought that was the most interesting part.
Yeah, and not just that. Something I didn't touch on in the first part of this episode is the powers come from these things called trigger events.
Yeah.
Taylor's trigger event, as an example, is when she's locked in a locker with, what is it, used tampons and pads, is that right?
Yeah, and other stuff. Like, it was basically from just all sanitary bins emptied out.
Yeah, and so that kind of gives you an example of trigger events are these really horrific events in somebody's life, and their powers are kind of tied to their trigger event.
Yeah.
And so, especially in these interludes, you really get a sense for... Basically, every cape has their own fucked up story, and their powers tie into it in a lot of interesting ways, and you kind of explore these messed up backstories of every single cape in a great way, especially in their interludes, which I really liked.
Yeah, and I liked getting insight into how like things like Bitch or Tattletale's powers worked, or Dinah, how her power worked. Like it, so that was interesting. But there were not too many of them. Like, it still obviously felt like Taylor was the center of the story, and we're always getting enough progress in her story. Yeah, but there were enough interludes that it really added to the depth of the world.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, so going back to what I was saying before, it's mostly through interludes you get like the dragon, the chapter from Dragon's perspective, where you found out she was like an AI.
Spoilers.
And not this amazing tinker. That was a great, so stuff like that. And
there are a lot of good twists in this story. Yeah,
and that like and so you were getting all these little bits of the world, and so at first I was like, oh, it's just a street level story. And we get a taste of like they describe things like Scion, who was like the original person with superpowers and is maybe not human, but it's all very confusing. But at first I was like, oh, this is going to be one of those stories where there's like more to the world that we don't see. But I think as the story's gone on, I realized Taylor's getting more and more caught up in this higher level stuff.
Yes.
And I think we might be heading, so like, for instance, one of the arcs I just finished, dealt with, so there are these things called the Endbringers, which are basically these 3 super powerful beings, which Tattletale figured out weren't humans. Like, I think the original theory was they were humans whose trigger event turned them into monsters. But
Godzilla-esque kaiju style monsters.
They're very the whole scene where they fight Leviathan when he attacks Brockton Bay just reminded me of Pacific Rim.
We should give a bit of background. So Brockton Bay is the city that it's set in. Leviathan is one of these Endbringers, and they are very, very, very overpowered.
Yeah, so, and I mean, it's basically a thing. So there's this thing called the Endbringer Truce, which is basically when they figure out an Endbringer is attacking a city, all of the heroes and villains basically unite and work together, and it's like all of the government and heroes basically promise not to arrest any villains.
Not to fight each other. Yeah.
And you basically get a free pass just as long as you're helping to fight the Endbringer. And it's like a quarter. So, and then like the Protectorate and the government things, they import all their heroes from around the country. And so it's basically like all of the most powerful heroes.
And even foreign heroes, yeah.
So it's like the whole world sort of gets behind it. And then still like a quarter of the people who enter the fight die. So you...
Actually, I read something interesting about this, which was that when Wildbow was writing these Endbringer fights, there's one or two later on in the story as well. What he would do is he would roll dice for each character to determine whether they lived or died, which I just thought was such an amazing way to insert this realism and kind of represent the brutality of these fights in the story. Is just each character's fate, live or death, is just determined by the roll of a dice in such a beautiful way.
I mean, there's a huge section in the Leviathan fight, like the first Endbringer they're fighting, where they lead you to believe that Tattletale's been killed. I was not okay with any of that.
Yes, I know. It hits hard.
It was such a cheap fake out, but I was okay with it because it just meant that Tattletale was still alive. So that was, it was cheap, but as long as she was still alive.
Yeah.
In the end.
So I mentioned in the first part that Tattletale is my favorite character. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. Regent's a close second, but he hasn't been featured anywhere near as much. So I feel like if I could get more time with Regent in the story, I could maybe see myself switching.
Fair enough.
But like Tattletale's sort of arrogant know-it-allness is just so entertaining to read, and her constant bluffing in fights and stuff is just hilarious.
Yeah, like she'll just say outlandish stuff. It's kind of like that scene in like a Poirot style mystery movie or a TV show where Poirot's like, and I know you are the killer, and the killer's like, oh no, it was me, and they kind of have this whole they expose they monologue basically, and then Tattletale is just like, yes, got that one. All right, good.
Because it's often like everyone sort of knows about her power, so it's constantly like she'll stop talking and people will be like, no, shut up. I know you're just going to manipulate me.
Yeah, everyone knows that she manipulates people by talking to them, and then she just does it. It's great.
Yeah, like they're like, oh, you're just going to manipulate me. And she's like, oh, okay, but also, and then we'll just end up manipulating them. And people are like, oh, I know what you're doing, but this is like, she's just so good at pushing people's buttons.
Yeah. She's a great character for sure.
Yeah. No, so a few other interesting things. So coming back to the community of the story, I noticed a lot of interesting things. So the few chapters I did manage to actually read, I noticed a lot of interesting stuff in the comments, including people, like there was a lot of people sort of doing, I guess I call it like backseat editing. So like, obviously you talked about how like, it was just like, he wants to go back and fix it up.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't any actual editing, like real authors like George R. R. Martin or J.K. Rowling, they have someone go through and edit their scripts, and he doesn't have that. Well, I thought he didn't, but it turns out he does. It's the WordPress comment army.
Yeah, well, after every new update was made, there would always be a thread full of typos for him to quickly adjust.
Yeah, and so there were like half of the comments were people saying like, oh, this sentence is awkward, and then there was just like a comment from Wildbow right underneath it being like, oh yeah, I fixed it.
Yeah.
The other part of that is like I did go to the wiki for Worm a couple of times, and I thought it was really interesting because reading a few of the pages, you'd see like the references down the bottom, because I was like, oh, what chapter was this described in? Like I was on the page for Leviathan, the Endbringer, trying to get an exact handle on his powers.
Yeah. And
there was some of the description of the power, and I was like, I don't remember reading that. Like, how was I meant to understand that? So I went to look up where it was from to make sure, like, maybe I was reading it too early. And the source was actually a comment by Wildbow on Reddit.
Oh, really? describing his power.
Yeah, so it turns out he's a prolific Redditor, and like about half of the sources that I was seeing for the Parahumans wiki were coming from just him commenting stuff on Reddit.
Just him commenting on Reddit. Interesting. Okay, so we've been going a bit long talking about Worm.
I mean, I thought this was going to happen. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing. It's just it's really enjoyable. You just want to gush about it, and there's so many deep characters to talk about.
He's created just such a detailed world filled with characters who are worth talking about. It reminds me in a lot of ways of something like A Song of Ice and Fire, like the Game of Thrones books by George R. R. Martin. In that regard, this is the most I've sort of gotten involved in a world and all of the characters inside of it.
Yeah, even these joke villains that show up or anything, they all have their intricate personalities and stories fleshed out, not just in the text but in Reddit comments as well. But let's try and move on from some of the gushing. Yes. Do you have any critiques you want to give? I mean, we touched on how the battles can get a bit hard to follow.
Yes, I mean, so that was a big one. Is sometimes the battles can just be tough to follow, and another one is that with this many characters, I mean, sometimes it would take me about like 10 minutes of audiobook after a character was reintroduced before I'd remembered what I was supposed to know about them. Like, it would feel a bit less organic in the writing, but just like blatantly reintroducing people through Taylor's narration, like, probably still would have been a good bet, just so I could remember who this was meant to be.
Yeah, it happens a lot where there's a character who has an interlude from their perspective, and then the next time you see them is 4 arcs later, which is like 2 days or whatever of reading through this material or listening through.
I think that like the first time I really felt exactly that was there's an interlude from the perspective of this guy called Gregor the Snail, and it introduces his gang, which is called Faultline's Crew, and it's really the first time you're properly introduced to them, and then they don't really come into it again for quite a while. And I like, as they were sort of fighting this other group, like 4 arcs later, I'm like, what are all their powers again? Like, they'd be like, oh, Neuter came down and used his power, and I was like, but what is it?
But what does it do? Like, he used his power to explode a hole in the wall, and then he used his power to create a bird, and you're like, wait, what is his power?
And then. Yeah, I guess another critique, like, I mean, actually, to be honest, it didn't really bother me, but, like, sort of, there's a lot of cliches in particular in the personal lives of the characters. So, like, the way Taylor was sort of overly bullied and stuff, it was very, like, I think everybody's read a million stories that have the sort of main character with that exact school backstory.
Yeah.
And same with, like, the relationship or the crush she has on Gru.
Well, stay tuned on that one. I don't know.
It's all very cliche, but I guess I don't mind that so much because it lets me focus on the rest of it in a way.
Yeah, I get the sense that as he was starting out writing this stuff, he kind of had to fall back on those cliches a lot.
Yeah.
As the story develops, they kind of get taken in interesting, or most of them get taken in pretty interesting places, or the ones that he couldn't figure it out, I think he just kind of dropped them a bit. But yeah, so stay tuned for most of that stuff, I'd say.
Yeah, and so like a lot of the things, like, as the Leviathan fight was going on, like this Endbringer's bringing like tidal waves and stuff into the city during the fight. And I was just kind of like, I don't really understand how they're going to like recover the city from this, and sort of the story's going to get back on track after this fight. And I've, it's been 4 arcs for me since that, and I've had to just accept that things aren't going to go back on track because the city's now just in ruins, and
the city is in ruins for
a while.
And
now it's being invaded by another gang of terrifying supervillains that are called the Slaughterhouse 9. And so it's just kind of like, it's very messy, but I guess like we've said, that I think that's quite realistic.
Yeah, like if a giant Godzilla attacked your city, it wouldn't be back to normal in a month or two.
Exactly. Especially a city that was already kind of as messed up as Brockton Bay was. But yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to critique from this. I've just been thoroughly enjoying it.
So you do think you're going to keep going?
Yeah, definitely. As much as I can.
Well, I won't tell you which characters live and die then.
Please don't.
All right, yeah. So let's end up with the score.
Yeah,
then.
I'm gonna give this a 9 out of 10.
Is that the highest we've had so far?
I don't know. It feels weird to go higher, but I almost want to.
Well, maybe after you finish it, we can edit the episode.
Yeah, exactly. I'd want to wait to finish it before I started going higher than 9 out of 10. But so far, where I'm up to, it's just been enthralling. Yeah.
Cool.
So I guess we've been going for a while, so we should probably end it there. But anyone who's listening / everyone who's listening, go read one. It's really good.
Cool.
Or listen to the audiobook, but be warned, it's 9 gigabytes of audio.
Oh,
I couldn't even get iTunes to tell me how long it is, but I'm pretty sure I've listened to over 100 hours.
All right. Thank you for listening to another episode of Media MD. I was leaving a space for you to jump in with something there, but all right.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything, so I just sort of
couldn't think of anything. All right, I'll just carry this ship by myself. That's okay. So yeah, on Media MD we have a Twitter, which is @MediaMDPodcast. We have a website, which is www.mediamdpodcast.com. And you know what? Why don't you go and rate us on iTunes? Because that would probably help us out. I don't know. I mean, I don't really understand how that whole system works, but I'm sure it would help.
Well, it couldn't hurt unless they gave us a terrible rating, so don't do that.
Oh, yes.